fact. I mean, on a daily basis, thinking about water consumption is something that we're privileged enough to not have to really think about as much. But the reality is the amount of people in the world that don't have access to clean, potable water is huge, and the deaths that come from treatable and preventable illnesses as a result of the lack of clean water is something that's very serious. So connecting all these things together, this is what Freedom in Creation has done. So artist therapy, like you saw, and they work with counselors once a week, art teachers, educators, and mental health counselors from Gulu come to support the art projects and to work with integrating former child soldiers, like I said, with youth that haven't been abducted. Art is education, taking that and applying it to real life things. There's a sustainable farm that I'll talk a little bit about that they're implementing now. So looking how to identify plants and crops and so on using art as a tool. The clean water infrastructure as being an underlying necessity in terms of continuing any art program is the need for clean water access and infrastructure. And then the sustainable farming. The land there is from what I'm told, because I haven't been, is very rich and fertile. And so the fact is that people are naturally farmers, and so it's reconnecting people after years in IDP camps back to the land and to build this sustainable farming practices, these best practices. Okay, so going forward into the needs assessment for the Global Village Education Program design. Were based on three things, essentially. One was my personal observations. My personal observations during semester at sea, during other service programs, service learning, community service projects, and international education programs that I was either a participant of or a staff member for. And then there were interviews. I had the opportunity to have a lot of diverse students and faculty at my fingertips while on board semester at sea that were from all different parts of this country and the world. So I was able to interview several faculty members, several staff members, and several students, and talking with them about more generally their ideas about service learning, reciprocity, and then more specifically on issues that they saw within the Semester at Sea program service projects, as well as other projects that they've done in the past. And then there were evaluations that I kind of compiled. Given that I was in the field office, I had access to field program evaluations. And so I would look and see what some of the reactions were from students in terms of what they were getting out of these experiences. So there were some recurring themes that came about in all of these things. One was that international service learning programs often place importance and value solely on the student learner. And if you research service learning, you'll find infinite amounts of resources on the benefits for the student learner and how this can expand so many horizons and it can make you more marketable and this and this and the third. Look for the benefits for the community, you're going to find much less. And that's largely because there's the assumption that the service project within itself is the benefit. So they're getting this service, so that's the benefit to the community, but it's more than that. And this is made clear by this excerpt. Without substantial consideration as to how a program both impacts and benefits local communities, international service learning programs have the potential to perpetuate the United States' role as a real or perceived global hegemony. Another thing was a general lack of an interconnected global context that programs often fail to develop. Looking at these larger global issues, globalization, and this interconnectedness of everything, often fail to meet those, and for students and participants to identify these interconnected things. And this was in this quote. Does someone want to read this so I'm not talking the whole time?
Many of the service learning programs that I've seen have been very superficial and lack opportunities to process the experience. This leaves students unclear as to what they were seeing, which is very counterproductive. Service learning needs to be able to teach a skill or help students get to a deeper level of the economic, sociological, and political issues so that they are learning instead of simply observing.
Okay. And what struck me here is this, the lack of opportunities to process the experience. So with semester at sea, there was very little opportunities for reflection. It was kind of, you do a program, you come back and you're doing something else. And also, the students were coming from different classes, so there was different agendas for being there. And it got muddy and it wasn't clear for a lot of students. And superficial in that a lot of the programs with Semester at Sea were run by tour operators. So how are you going to run service projects with local organizations or schools when it's run for a for-profit tour company? It doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. The next thing is that international service learning projects focus on compartmentalized issues without critically thinking about the larger social, environmental, and economic impacts that connect the program participants to the community. It goes a little bit off the last thing about the global context, but the compartmentalized thing is big. And it happens here with service projects or volunteer work. I mean, going to a soup kitchen to work there, or to go to an orphanage, or whatever it might be. It's looking at an immediate need, but it's not necessarily looking at what's the larger situation, or what's the larger problem that's taking place for these things to continue. And so a student put it this way, that yeah, we got to play with children at an orphanage, and we got to help run their feeding program, but we never learned the reasons as to why these children were really there in the first place. And this happened on several occasions where there was orphanage visits in various countries. And there was one in Cape Town that they didn't even talk about apartheid as being a reason why these orphans are there. Talking about HIV epidemic, but not really going into depth as to how come it's an epidemic in this region. What are some of the causes and effects of that? And then there's the lack of shared vision and the lack of dialogue, which has led time and time again to unrealistic expectations held by both the communities that are involved and the students. And as a result, there's unequal decision making, there's an unequal balance in the participation, because people don't know who it's really benefiting. And there was a lot of programs with Semester at Sea, for example, again, where students could feel that, and they felt that the whole experience was catered to their needs, and it was them that they were focusing on rather than the partnering organization or whatever the project was. And this is a long one, but it's a good one. Does someone else want to read? Okay.
Any experience that brings privileged North American students to a place where they can see and have empathy for the situation of another is a growth experience for them. However, I'm not sure that's enough. Without the academic support that they need to really understand, connect with, and reflect on what they are seeing and the reasons behind it, I think it's very easy to become paternalistic and carry this idea of the white man's burden. So even though the intentions may be kind and generous, it's a perspective of asymmetric power, and it's the lack of realization of that power that comes about in these situations.
So it's kind of long, kind of dense, but it's true in a lot of ways that there's this paternalistic attitude that students bring a lot of ways, that they're coming to fix a problem for a community that can't fix it themselves. So we're going to come in and help them build something or fix something, and we're going to feel good about ourselves for doing that, but it's not looking at the deeper issues once again. Anyone else?
If what you create doesn't have long-lasting value or doesn't consider what the community deems as important, you are running the risk of simply running poverty tourism instead of service learning program.
And this was actually a coworker of mine in the field office who we were like, these things are poverty tourism. I mean, a for-profit tour company is getting paid to bus U.S. students into a marginalized community and do a little tour, pick up some babies, take some pictures, and feel a feel-good experience. And it was really like striking and shocking that people were. That was the service that they. That was the experiences they were taking home with them in regards to service projects. And so the last quote is from Andrew Briggs, who I interviewed, like I said, who was traveling with us. And this kind of sums up and connects us again to the Global Village Education Program. So if one person wants to read this. Lacey.
Service learning programs must identify ways to build bridges, but ultimately must let communities speak for themselves in a way that would transcend a stereotypical depiction of pity. This appropriately challenges the understanding that these people are dreamers. They are creative and intelligent. They are also incredibly capable. When we easily buy into the notion that they are simply victims to be pitied, it can undermine that dignity and undermine those relationships of reciprocity and the great conversation from which these people from all nations have so much to learn.
So, this is in essence, where that connection comes from with wanting to design a program with freedom and creation, because we're on the same page with these ideas. And so looking back at those pictures, I'm not going to ask who felt what, but I would imagine that there was a sense initially of a pity for people or for the situation. And it's that conscious movement to not have that pity, because then it falls into, again, this unbalanced power dynamic of privilege and power, and having this feeling like you have to do something for people because they can't help themselves. And it's really not about that. It's working together in collaboration on things and sharing ideas and having the teacher and student change. And so you're not just someone who's instilling knowledge and wisdom on somebody, but you're also a student who's learning from others as well. So the needs assessment, that was specifically for the participants and how to design the program based on those types of needs. The needs for Freedom and Creation as an organization have been ongoing since 2007, and working with the local community. I should say that Freedom and Creation is an interesting organization. It's a 501c3 nonprofit in the U.S., and then it's a non-government organization which is autonomous from FIC in the U.S., which is run all by local people within Coralville. So there's a country director, staff, all local, volunteers, mental health counselors, art teachers are all local, and are all determine their own needs in terms of the direction that these projects should go. So the Global Village Education Program, this is an collaborative artwork painting done finished in Uganda, started in Washington, D.C. Okay, so the Global Village Education Program is an intensive 5-week cross-cultural experience that would take place during the summer, most likely. And its foundation is based on critical pedagogy, critical thinking, artist education, artist therapy, experiential education, and collaborative learning. So through the mutually beneficial projects that promote reciprocity, participants will develop a critical analysis of Uganda's history, culture, and socioeconomic conditions from the macro to micro level. So looking at the country and then more specifically into a local rural village and how that impacts the socioeconomic conditions there. What are the cultural differences between the two? The historical situation between the north and the south, and reasons and impacts. And then through a process of dialogue and reflection, deeper connections will be made to learn about the impacts, both positive and negative, about globalization and its impact on Uganda, and then as well as within the world. So, goals and objectives. The GVE program is to instill conceptual clarity and intellectual growth by introducing participants to new knowledge, concepts, and experiences through cross-cultural interaction. And it's also to expand FIC program models that are already currently existing, or that currently exist, and combine that with social justice, conflict resolution, service learning, and global education with cultural immersion. And then finally, again, is to connect the economic, social, and environmental issues that result from matters of increasing globalization. So participants, that was the program goals. The participant goals, it's to interact with the local community and to really get a sense of what life is like in northern Uganda through the perspective of the community that they're staying with. And by doing so, it'll provide them tools necessary for critical thinking and analysis with the intention of further developing their ideas and engagement when they return to their home communities in the US or wherever it might be. And then again, it's to gain this greater awareness on some global issues that can connect the issues in Uganda to the issues that they face in their own communities, or global issues that we all face. And then they'll be participating in learning about social movements, both in Uganda and throughout the world, that were formed in response to these issues, and specific leaders that have devoted themselves to this positive social change. And so, issues of water security, food security, global warming, these types of things will be looked at critically. So part one, Kampala, it's in 3 parts, I should say. This program design is 3 parts. The first one is Kampala, and that's the arrival and orientation. Again, Kampala is in the southern region. That's the capital city. And the reason for this is for the participants to get a sense of life in the southern region of Uganda in an urban setting, and then moving up north to Gulu or Korowabili where it's much more rural. And to see the contrast and some comparisons, some cultural differences within the country itself. During this part, globalization will be introduced, and the theories, which I'll get into in a minute, will also be introduced during this portion. Part 2 is the Gulu or Korowabili Collaborative Service Projects in Homestay. So this will be a 3-week portion of the program. I should say that part 1 will be a 4-day orientation in Kampala. The second part will be in northern Uganda, and that's when we'll be working with the collaborative projects with Freedom and Creation, and then they'll also be staying with a homestay family in Gulu or in Korowabili. And I'm actually in contact and have been in contact with a friend, Pimp69, her name is Janet, who's from Gulu, Uganda, and she is going to help with the acquiring of families within the local community to participate in the program when we're at the point to do so. And then the part 3 will be the Reentry workshop, and this is at Queen Elizabeth National Park. And the reason for this is to have students to process their experience, what they just went through, and how they're going to take it with them back home. What are they going to do when they get back to their own communities? It's also specifically chosen at the National Park to focus on the environmental impacts. As this program goes on, looking at globalization and looking at the social impacts and the environmental impacts firsthand, this will be a perfect opportunity for them to be in a more an environment surrounded by natural beauty and can see the realities firsthand of climate change and development work that's taking place. Okay, so some theoretical foundations.
How long was part 3?
Oh, I'm sorry. Part 3 is another 4 days. Yeah. So it's a 4.5-week program. This will also introduce participants to the idea of reverse culture shock, and sharing experiences and how to process what they just had gone through. Okay, so some theoretical foundations. Basically, it's pulling theories from 4 categories: service learning, critical pedagogy, social identity development, and experiential learning. So service learning can be defined as a form of experiential education in which students engage in activities that address human and community needs together with structured opportunities intentionally designed to promote student learning and development. And again, specifically to promote student learning and development, it's most of the definitions out there are still with the focus of the participant, the student learner, as being the focus. So in looking at service, one is to even challenge the idea of the term service learning, because it could be argued that that itself is perpetuating unequal power dynamics, given the fact that that means that there's, by definition, there's a server and someone who's being served. So it's looking critically at service projects or collaborative projects for what, by whom, and for whom. So what are the projects for, and who are they benefiting, and who is working on them, and why? And this is something, a critical analysis that should be looked at in all work that we do, is for what purpose and who's benefiting and why. And this is just to illustrate the fact that oftentimes people participate in service learning programs and projects because it benefits them first and foremost, because it makes them feel good about themselves, it adds notches to their resume, it makes them more marketable. There's a number of reasons why it's beneficial to the participants. So the philosophy is really heavily rooted in reciprocity and this idea of mutual exchange. So Captain, can you read that for me?
Reciprocity is the exchange of both giving and receiving between the server and the person or group being served. All parties in service learning are learners and help to determine what is to be learned. Both the server and those served teach and both learn. In service learning, those being served control the service provided. The needs of the community determine what the service tasks will be. Building programs on a philosophy of reciprocal learning can thus help to avoid the ever-present pitfall of paternalism disguised under the name of service.
So paternalism disguised under the name of service is something that happens quite frequently, and it's largely part because there's not critical thought going into what this means and how it's impacting people and others. So connecting service learning theory with critical pedagogy, critical thinking skills, building these skills for participants and then also for community members. Here's a painting of Paulo Freire. He's a Brazilian philosopher, educator, responsible largely for the popular education, non-formal education movement in Brazil during the 1960s, and is known as the father, so to speak, of critical pedagogy and critical thinking. So Henry Giroux can define critical pedagogy as an educational movement guided by passion and principle to help students develop consciousness of freedom, recognize authoritarian tendencies, and connect knowledge to power and the ability to take constructive action. Paulo Freire's most famous and well-known work, which I highly recommend everyone to read. It's dense, but it's very important, I think, to a lot of our educations, given that we're all from S.I.T. The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And from this, I pulled out four things that I'm connecting with service learning. The differences are pedagogy for the oppressed. Paulo Freire argues that critical consciousness or critical thinking needs to be taking place within those that are oppressed. Service learning is critical thinking taking place by student learners. So this is merging them together. So there's a connection between the two of them. One is this praxis as cultural action for freedom. This was a slogan that Ferrari used in the 1960s for the Landless People's Movement, farmers, organizing farmers. And this is the idea that the cultural axis for freedom is that everyone is responsible for history making. In other words, history making isn't only to be left for those that have power. It's not only those that have the power that get to control and determine what the history of this world is going to be. And so it's connecting it to service learning. It's moving beyond taking care of immediate needs to community action that frees people from those needs. It's looking at how to work on projects that can build to a point where then they don't need that project anymore because it's something that they're sustaining themselves as a community, as opposed to having a project that's operating for 20-some years and it's operating because it's keeping the status quo. That goes into this, the dynamic nature of reality. And that's to either choose that reality is stagnant and predetermined, or it has the potential to change depending on what people choose to do. So if it's predetermined and static, then what's the point of service projects in the first place? If it's predetermined as this is what it's going to be like, and we can't change these situations for people, then service projects begin to turn into what Ferrari calls false generosity. And that's generosity, but keeping the status quo of everything the same so there isn't any structural changes. So the dynamic nature of reality refers to the idea of making these larger changes to change the status quo. Then there's the balance of power. And this is what it looks like. It's a reciprocal arrangement from those helping and those being helped. And to have that balance. And to continue to have open dialogue and communication to maintain that balance. And when all else fails, to have the decision-making go to those who are in those local communities who are working. And then the fourth is conscientization, which is a long word. It translates essentially to critical consciousness in Portuguese. And so identifying the shift of consciousness, looking at being willing to think critically about things that we're taught to think uncritically about. A two-party political system, or our addiction to consumer tendencies, things like that. Must expose and reject the deficit theory. This is to say that not to hold those that are oppressed responsible for their own conditions, and not to blame someone for that situation because they didn't work hard enough or what have you. These are structural and systemic issues, and that's going into this, that the inequalities and oppressions that we see in our own communities, and then when specifically for this program, are systemic and not just individual practices. So looking at these larger systemic reasons for these inequalities and oppressions. And then finally is, or not finally, but next is must be careful to avoid the savior syndrome. That's that paternalism disguised as service, coming in to do good and to help and wanting to help. And so that's something that with the participants is going to be a constant discussion about, is what are the reasons why they chose to do a service program in the first place? What are the core values that one sees in doing service, and identifying with that. Okay, the final is the must understand human relations issues is all intertwined. So oppression comes in many different forms. So there's racism, but then there's also gender equality. In Uganda, for example, the homosexuality is something that is it's a very oppressive situation for people in those situations. So oppression comes in different forms and things are intertwined. Moving into understanding this is challenging, and it's going to push participants in many different ways. And so this theory, social identity development theory, it's a combination of white theory and black theory, these black identity and white identity theories connected together. And it's moving through a continuum from a no social conscious or a naiveness to acceptance, to resistance, to redefinition, and to internalization. So the passive and active is more or less conscious or unconsciously having these things. So no social conscious is what it sounds like. From infancy to early 3-4 years old, you are not really aware of your conscious or your identity. Moving into an acceptance where one understands and accepts their social norms, the identity norms, based on their gender or color of their skin. Moving into the resistance is recognizing issues that are taking place and recognizing some inequalities perhaps, or problems that you see with different social identities. And then moving into a redefinition. Redefinition is redefining your own identity, understanding these things are real and working towards redefining that into a new identity. Finally is the internalization, and that's where one is completely aware and conscious of the power dynamics and moving forward into this new developed identity as a result. Now, given the time, that's all I can spend on it. I'd be happy to talk with people more about this theory afterwards. It's very interesting and it connects very relative to the work with this program. The next is the experiential learning cycle. I'm going to skip it based on time here, but I'm assuming, given all children of S.I.T, have some understanding and recognition of what experiential learning is. But essentially it's moving in this cycle of concrete experience, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. So moving into the GV curriculum, wanting to take these questions and looking at these throughout the program. This is to say, where are we? Where are we in the world? Where are we as a human race? Where are we as people in our country in relationship to others? Where are we socially and environmentally? In order to know where we are, we have to know how did we get here. So we're here, but how did we get to this place in the world? What are things that happen to lead us to this? Decisions or ideas that we have. The next is what is possible for the future. So we know where we are. We know how we got here. Now, what's possible for the future? What can we do to make positive changes in the future? And that kind of connects, okay, so where do we go from here? We know this information, now what? And, that's certainly a question I've been faced, and I'm sure many of you have been faced with time and time again, here at S.I.T. and then in real life experiences, okay? We have this information, now what do we do with it? So, themes of the GVE program are going to be rethinking globalization, looking at the issues of consumption, connecting environmental issues with social issues, looking at the impacts of free trade. Is it fair? Looking at globalization from the economic perspective, connecting issues of our demand for oil and other countries' access to it, and so for example, Uganda has newly discovered oil. And after 25 years of fighting with the LRA, the US government under President Obama sent troops to Uganda to help combat the LRA. It's coincidental that it's also right at this time of newly discovered oil as well. So looking at these issues. Next is questioning what is sustainability. It's a buzzword oftentimes, and people say it a lot, but what does it really mean? So looking at practices, sustainable practices, and really trying to get a more definitive idea of what it is. And then promoting reciprocity through collaboration. This is an underlying theme throughout. So collaboration within the group, collaboration with Homestay families, and collaboration with Freedom and Creation projects. But having reciprocity, mutual understanding, and mutual benefits being the forefront of these projects. So the curriculum is broken up into site visits and lectures. This is site visits from different organizations, NGOs, social movements in the areas. And then lectures with local professors from Gulu University who have actually relations with freedom and creation. The second will be dialogue and reflection. Given that there was such a lack of it from my experiences with Semester at Sea and some other programs, this is a fundamental component of the curriculum. So to have intentional times for group dialogue within the group of participants, and then with dialoguing with the community, and looking at these issues that I've mentioned, and to connect with them further. The reflection piece is also allowing them to process what's going on. So there has to be open and candid discussions amongst participants and faculty and staff as to what people are feeling, because these are very intense and very heavy things that we're focusing on, and it's certain that people are going to have different reactions to it. A homestay, which is probably their most important intercultural experience, would be staying with a family in Gulu, and this is something from experience living with homestay families. It's something that's very intensive, but it's it's something often that is life-changing, and people will remember forever. And it's those experiences, those connections on a human level that people start to realize and see. And so the homestay is put in place for that reason. And then the collaborative projects, which we've talked about. So I'll talk a little bit about the collaborative projects moving forward. So building off of what you saw as the foundations or pillars of freedom and creation, art is education and art is therapy. There's the collaborative FIC art project. This is where participants will be able to engage with youth from the freedom and creation program on collaborative art projects, be able to monitor and observe a class, and then following week begin to implement their own lesson plan with the art program. And so